Hey, thanks. Yeah, as mentioned, I'm talking about Turbo Native today. So let's just quickly cover what's going to be on the agenda. So the first thing is we'll talk about what a hybrid app actually is, just to make sure we're all on the same page about hybrid technology. Then we'll discuss how they got such a bad rap because I don't know, for some reason the tech industry does seem to hate hybrid apps. So we'll talk about how this may have happened and see why it may not be true. We'll talk about what Turbo Native is. Go back to basics and just talk about what it is, and a method of getting hybrid apps right, because they have such a bad rap in the industry for a reason. So there is a very easy wrong way of doing it. So we'll talk about how we can get them right. Before diving in, the obligatory about me slide. My name is Ayush, as I said, and I live in London. And that's my little avatar on all my social profiles. Not quite that rock and roll in reality, but I'm allowed to exaggerate on the internet, so I went with the yeah, no, that's not, I can't do that in real life. I used to be a mobile developer for 5 years, and then in 2020 I switched to Ruby and Rails, and now I'm a freelancer. So I specialize in mainly building websites with Ruby and Rails as well. That's my freelance business. Apart from my job, I have many fingers in many different pies. So one of the things I do is I co-host a podcast with a friend of mine called Jared. It's called Just a Spec. It's a podcast about the projects, the people, and the protocols that make the open standard of the internet possible. Yeah, I think something like that. You would think I know the tagline for my own podcast, but here we are. I'm on the core team of Bridgetown, which is a progressive site generator, we call it. It started life as a fork of Jekyll, but it's kind of taken on its own life now. So if you ever use Jekyll and you're a bit fed up of it, I'd highly recommend checking out Bridgetown. And finally, I also run a little small indie web app called Scattergun, which is like a privacy-focused mailing list platform, although it's kind of on pause at the moment. But yeah, and I've also written a book, which some of you I may have attacked you with a flyer about this book. I actually realized on the way to the party last night that I opened pre-orders on this book 1 year ago yesterday. So it's a bit of a milestone weekend for me, which is quite cool. But yeah, I think it's the most comprehensive resource on Rails and Hotwire out there. So if you're interested in those topics, please do check it out. Anyway, enough about me. Let's talk about what a hybrid app is. So hybrid app is one that combines web technologies like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript along with native APIs. So the degree to which these two worlds collide, it just depends on what tools you use. So like a couple of mainstream tools for hybrid apps are Cordova, which used to be called PhoneGap, and React Native. These are like what most people would associate with hybrid apps. And we'll talk about these a bit more in a bit. But now let's take a rather sizable detour into the Chinese hills. And where a long time ago, there used to be a monastery where a distinguished Taoist guru used to live with his disciples. And every evening, the monks would gather in the Great Hall to listen to their leaders' teachings and to meditate. But there was a problem. A cat had adopted that monastery as its home. And every evening, it would follow the monks into this great hall where it would mewl, it would scratch, it would just generally be annoying during their silent meditation. Eventually, the teacher got so fed up of this that he instructed the monks to put a collar on the cat and tether it to the far side of the monastery. So that way it wouldn't disturb their meditation. And for a while, this worked well. Every evening, the teacher, the monks, the cat would just go about their nightly routine without any issue. Until one day that the learned teacher died. But the monks, they continued to tie up the cat every evening. Until one day, the cat died. So what the monks did was they went down to the nearest village and they bought a replacement cat, and they tied that up every evening instead. Um, 2 centuries later, religious scholars write learned essays on the importance of tying up a cat prior to evening meditation. This is an ancient Buddhist tale called the Tale of the Tethered Cat. And it serves to explain principles that have outlived the conditions that created them. Now, tech loves a tethered cat. Like, this is my personal favorite. This is some Christian kind of stole my thunder by basically making this the centerpiece of his talk yesterday. So I think you can all agree with me that this is complete bollocks. But yes, I think this stuff gets so ingrained in the industry, and I think the notion that hybrid apps are bad, I think, is another tethered cat. So, like, I've heard so many things over the years, like hybrid apps are slow, hybrid apps, they don't look native, they're even insecure. And it's just like, how did this become so ingrained in the industry? And I have one theory. Well, I think the foundation was laid by this. Mark Zuckerberg in 2012 said, the biggest mistake we've made as a company is betting on HTML5 over native. And of course, if Lord Zuckerberg says it, it must be true, right? Facebook, I think, rewriting their HTML app in using fully native tech and then shouting about it, I think it laid the foundation for this myth. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is the tools that I mentioned earlier, Cordova and React Native. Now, both these tools rely on one philosophy, which is you have one shared code base between your two platforms. Now, that doesn't work. That has never worked. That will never work. Does anyone remember Java apps? Like, yeah, exactly. Someone remembers. When was the last time you encountered a truly delightful Electron app? It just, you can't share one code base between two platforms. It doesn't work. On top of that, Cordova also it builds your entire app's UI in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, iOS and Android have pre-differing platform standards. So you can't really have one standard UI between the two of them. The users just won't get a familiar experience, and it just won't feel like an app. It'll just feel like a website in a box, and that's just a bit of a crap user experience. So that's kind of like why I don't think Cordova is a good idea. React Native, I think, the less I say about it is probably best, otherwise the talk's just going to turn into a rant. So instead, I'm just going to show you what the former lead developer of React Native used to have in his Twitter bio. It says, partly to blame for React Native, sorry. I mean, that just says more than I ever could. So anyway, let's just move on and let's agree that these tools are not that great. And I think between these tools and Mark Zuckerberg's quote back in 2012, I think we established a textbook tethered cat. But before we look at why these presumptions may not be quite valid in 2023, let's take another detour. This time, we'll go into the English countryside. And there was a man who had a long way to walk to work. And every day he would have to go a long way out of his way because there was a hedge that blocked the most direct route. So every day in the morning, he would walk a mile further than he had to, and then again in the evening, and you'd have to walk like an extra hour every day. And every day you would think that, oh, if only that hedge wasn't there, I could save myself an hour of walking every day. Eventually, he'd had enough, and he made a hole in the hedge so he could walk the most direct route. And that was the day that the bull that lived on the other side of the hedge killed him. How a Texas Longhorn bull found its way in the English countryside, I'll leave up to your imagination, but it's fiction. Let's just roll with it. So this tale was established by a British philosopher and writer called G.K. Chesterton. And it's called Chesterton's Fence. And he used it to explain that we should remove a rule before fully understanding why it was first put into place and all the effects that its presence has. I think this is a great counterpoint to the tailor the tethered cat, where we shouldn't just willy-nilly throw rules away just because we don't think they apply anymore. Let's try to understand why these rules were established. So let's try to understand the circumstances around which this rule that hybrid apps are bad was established. So Mark Zuckerberg's quote was from 2012, which is 11 years ago. The world of mobile JavaScript performance was very different back then. Like, I went through my drawers and I found an old iPhone 6 and I ran a speedometer test on it. And that's the score I got, 24.8. And that's still 2 years newer than when Mark Zuckerberg was slandering hybrid tech. And then I ran the same test on my current phone, which is an iPhone 13 mini. And this was the score that it got. Now, that is just unreal. Like, what a ridiculous jump in performance in just 11 years. Okay, granted, we're looking at a $600 top-of-the-line phone here. But after I got these results, I just started messaging friends and family who have Android phones and said, can you just run this test and tell me what you get? And anecdotally, you'd still get scores about between 60 to 100 on speedometer. Okay, this is not scientific data, obviously, because I've just messaged some friends and family. But I think you're still looking at like a 3x improvement on 2014 in mobile JavaScript performance, which is still absolutely staggering. So I think the world now is quite different from back when hybrid apps developed their bad rap. So I think it's worth reconsidering this approach and trying it again and seeing whether it works. So when should we go hybrid? Because obviously it's a cliche, but they're not a silver bullet. They're not right for every scenario. I think they work best when you have when the beating heart of your app is a server-rendered web app that speaks HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Preferably if you're using like a full-stack framework like Rails, Laravel, or Django. That's when I think a hybrid app makes the most sense. If you're building something like an Uber, which needs like quite deep native integration, and may not even need a web app, then that's probably where hybrid is the wrong route. That's when you want to go fully native. So it really just depends on the use case. Well, why should we go hybrid? The biggest advantage is you get to reuse all your views from the web app. So your HTML, CSS, JavaScript from your web app, you can just reuse all of them. Because if you're building fully native apps, then you have to rebuild every single screen 3 times. Now, for small teams, that's just really hard. For individuals, it's impossible. So it's a huge competitive advantage if you could you reuse your views across all 3 platforms. Because it's hybrid, you also have one foot firmly in native land. So you can still use your native APIs like push notifications, maps, contacts, all that. Everything that makes an app, you can still use all of that. So that's really cool because you kind of get best of both worlds up to a point. And I think one of the biggest advantages, you can push updates remotely from the web app. Obviously, there's a limit to what you can do, but you'd be surprised after you kind of hit a level of stability with your native code. You can push pretty significant stuff by just making a server deploy. And yeah, this for now is perfectly legal under App Store regulations. Who knows whether they'll change their mind in the future, but it's still a pretty big advantage. So let's dig into how we go about all of this now. Let's talk about a better approach to build hybrid apps. Well, the main thing is you want separate code bases for iOS and Android. Like I said earlier, you don't want to share a code base. It just doesn't work. So create a native app backbone using fully native tech. So you would use Xcode, you would use Android Studio, and Swift and Kotlin just to build like a native backbone. And within that, you render web content. So this is what it looks like. So you have your navigation bar and the tab bar, all like similar components depending on what your UX is, which are fully native. But the actual content of the screen is just a web view which renders HTML content. So that way, your app kind of becomes like a custom web browser in a way. And the real advantage here is all the stuff that you kind of expect what a platform, like what an app on a given platform should look like, you just get for free. Like on iOS, you kind of expect screens to transition in a certain way. You expect to be able to swipe from left to right to go back a step. All that stuff just works because the navigation and the backbone is all fully native. So you get all that for free. So yeah, the app looks like an app and not like a website in a box. And this is where Turbo Native kind of comes into the picture. That's where it can help. So what is Turbo Native? Well, it's part of the Hotwire suite of tools, which is a set of open source front-end tools by 37 Signals. And one third of the suite is Turbo, which is a JavaScript library, and it's extended by Turbo Native. The second part is Stimulus, which is a purely JavaScript library, which is, it gives you a way to kind of attach pieces of JavaScript logic encapsulated in the form of controllers to any HTML elements. And the third part is Strada, which hasn't been released yet. It's going to be released at Rails World at the beginning of October. So there's not a lot known about what exactly it is, but it's something to do with hybrid apps that kind of enhances Turbo Native in some way. We'll find out more in October. So let's look closely at Turbo Native. It's a native library for iOS and Android. So it doesn't share a code base or anything. It's not JavaScript. It's written in Swift on iOS and Kotlin on Android. So conceptually, the library is very similar across both platforms. Like if you read the code base, a lot of like the jargon will instantly make sense. But because it's implemented using platform-specific design patterns, using Swift and Kotlin, the implementation is actually quite different. And I think that kind of goes back to my earlier point that you shouldn't share a code base between the two platforms. So this, I think, it kind of goes with that particular philosophy. And it extends Turbo, specifically Turbo Drive on the web. If you've used Rails, you're probably familiar with Turbo, or at least its predecessor, Turbo Links. But if you're not, let's just talk about what it is, because it's kind of critical to how Turbo Native works. So Turbo Drive on the web, it's a JavaScript library. It will intercept link clicks. So when you click on a link, it'll intercept that in JavaScript, and then it'll make a fetch request to the destination. And then it'll just swap the body element out with the response. And it'll also update the URL with the push state API. So this gives you quite a lot of performance benefits because you're not kind of downloading all the JavaScript and CSS, all that stuff again. You're just swapping the body element out. And it also kind of makes your app feel a bit more single page, even though it's a multi-page app. So that's Turbo Drive specifically on the web. So how does Turbo Native augment this flow? Well, when your app loads a web page for the first time, Turbo Native will install itself as an adapter on Turbo Web. How does it do that? Well, both iOS and Android have native APIs that let you communicate with JavaScript in a web view. So it's a two-way pathway with a web view. So Turbo uses that to install itself as an adapter, and it allows Turbo Native to place itself right in the middle of Turbo's request cycle. So now, in a Turbo Native app, when you click a link, instead of making just a fetch request, it calls a native method. In this native method, you can make a decision. You can either proceed with the default navigation, or you can present a fully native screen. This is a really cool approach because you're never all in on either camp, web or native. You can kind of make a piecemeal approach of it. Let's say you have an app where there's one single screen where the user spends 90% of their time. You can build out that one screen fully natively so that the user gets the best possible experience for that screen. And for the rest of it, which is not that heavily used, you can still use your web views. So it gives you a really fine-grained approach on how native you want to go. And that's really powerful. So let's zoom into what is this default navigation in Turbo Native. Well, when you click a link, the first thing that'll happen is you create a new instance of a web view. A new instance of a native screen. in that native screen, you inject the web view. And then finally, you use Turbo to navigate the web view to the destination, and then just present that to the user. So the user just sees one seamless transition to the new screen. They don't even notice what all this magic is going on in the background. And also, you kind of reuse the same instance of the web view across the entire app, and it's just navigated using Turbo. So you still get all the performance benefits that Turbo gives you. So let's take a look at this in action, because proof's in the pudding. Okay, it's test data, but that looks pretty native to me, and that's literally all. That's just web content. So yeah, that's quite cool. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed this fully native login button in the top right corner. Now, this is a hybrid app. How have we rendered a fully native component in a hybrid app? Well, you remember I mentioned earlier that both iOS and Android have native APIs that let you communicate with JavaScript, and that's how Turbo installs itself as an adapter. Well, we can use the same pathway as well. Nothing's stopping us from doing that. So we can build a web-to-native bridge to send messages from our web app to the native code saying, do this thing for me. So that's really cool. So what you can do is, like in JavaScript, you can post messages to your native app. And then if you do something like that, then this Swift method gets called with that message. So now you have some information that your web app is sent in fully native code. You can do with that whatever you want. These are the equivalent methods in Android. So it's very similar on both platforms. And then if you want to go the other way, you can evaluate JavaScript from native code in a web view. So all you got to do is just call evaluate JavaScript and give it a script, and it'll just evaluate it in the web view. And that's how you do it on Android. So it's really powerful when you have this two-way bridge to kind of take the level of fidelity of your app a little bit higher and give it a little bit more of a native feel. So how would we implement this login button in our hybrid world? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to render a proxy web element that kind of acts as a communication bridge for it. So we just render just a simple link. We attach a stimulus controller to it called bridge element. I'll show you what that is in a sec. And we just assign some more data attributes that kind of will tell the native app what to do with it. Like in this case, it just tells what kind of component it should render it as in the native world. This is what the stimulus controller would look like. So the connect method is called when the controller first attaches itself to the DOM. So the first thing we do, obviously, is we make it invisible because we don't want this visible in the website. It's just a proxy element. And then we render it. So the bridge element class is just a simple Java class to encapsulate the data attributes that I showed on the previous slide. So it's just some syntactic sugar to kind of encapsulate that. And it also, it'll use a meta value on the document to determine which platform it's running on, because the platform, the message it has to construct to send to the app depends on the platform. So just all our logic's kind of encapsulated in bridge element. And then we also have this concept of a web bridge, which is just a construct that uses the adapter pattern to call the correct native API, because the APIs they look slightly different on iOS and Android to send messages. So it just uses the adapter pattern to call the right one. And then we just serialize bridge element to JSON, and we post it to the native app where we can do with it whatever we want. So in this case, we would receive that message, and then we would write some native code that renders this login button. And then to handle the click of the login button, well, we just use some JavaScript to locate that proxy element in the DOM and click it. And that's it. It's just the native button just acts as a trigger for this. And yeah, you can do the same thing on Android as well. So let's see what that looks like. So yeah, that's a fully native button performing a web action. The fact that it's presented modally, that's just a configuration option in Turbo Native. There's nothing fancy going on out there. It's just a simple config. You can do that with any link. So yeah, fully native button triggering a link, which I think is really cool. So let's just recap the bridge. So it allows you to pass messages back and forth from JavaScript to the web. And you can build fully native components that trigger web actions. And you're not really restricted to just native components either, because it's just a message passing bridge. You can do whatever you want. Like sky's the limit, really. It just depends on what your app's use case might be. You can render all sorts of components, menus, buttons, tabs around your web content. So you just take the fidelity that little bit higher and make your app look more app-like. And this is what Strada is meant to help with. It's meant to provide some kind of abstraction layer or a standardization, or something around this web to native bridge world. What it is, well, we'll find out at Rails World in a few weeks' time. Cool. So to wrap up, let's address the big burning question. Is the experience as good as a fully native app? No, sorry, it just isn't. I'm not going to beat around the bush. It's just not, but it's good enough. I think after a point of time, you just get diminishing returns. You could spend millions of dollars or whatever on teams to build your app fully natively on both iOS and Android, but is it really worth it? I don't know. I think for the right use case, I think hybrid packs one hell of a punch. I can't stress this enough. The consumer doesn't care. You can write your app in WebTech, Swift, Kotlin, fucking assembly for all the user cares. It doesn't matter. All they want to do is accomplish the task that they opened your app to do. They don't care what you've written it in. So as long as your app works well, the underlying technology is not important. Now, we can prove this by looking at two very obvious examples in Hey and Basecamp, which are like the flag bearers, if you will, for Turbo Native. They both have very high App Store ratings. But I think a slightly more unexpected example is the BBC Sport app. Now, yeah, that's hybrid as well. It doesn't use Turbo Native as far as I know, but it uses the exact same approach of rendering web content within native navigation. If you don't believe me, go to any BBC Sport URL and put .app at the end of it, and you will see the version that is served to the app. And it's got over 400,000 ratings, and it has an App Store rating of 4.7 as a hybrid app. I don't think there's any more validation needed for this technology. And if we compare this to a highly popular, fully native app, well, yeah. Well, the point I'm just trying to make is it's possible to build a fully native app that's substandard. It's also possible to build a hybrid app that's delightful. Thank you.
Any questions?
I have a question. Am I correct by saying that if you use like this native solution, you would need to create at least some part of code base, especially for iOS, and second part of code base for Android?
Yes, you would need to write at least some native code. You would have to have an iOS and an Android repository. Yeah, you would have to. And I think it's worth the investment because once you get to a certain point, you can pretty much just stop development on the native platforms and the web can just drive everything. But yeah, you have to get to that one point where you're laying this foundation of your app fully natively.
Do you have any use cases of where using hybrid is not a good idea from your experience, that you found that it wasn't a good route to go?
Not from personal experience, just because I spent most of my time when I was building mobile apps professionally. I was doing it fully natively, and now I specialize in Rails. So I haven't built a whole lot of hybrid apps myself, but it's usually when you're not using a web app that speaks HTML, JavaScript, and CSS as like the core of your product. If that's not the case, then hybrid's not going to work, because the biggest advantage is you get to reuse your HTML views. So if you don't have that, then hybrid doesn't make a lot of sense.
Anyone else?
Do you have any experience testing these apps, creating automated tests for this kind of apps?
No.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
There.
Sorry.
Do you have some kind of scaffold application or generator? We use generators in Rails so that I can create a scaffold and like do a couple of steps, like the less the better, in order to like deploy this application and have it usable on my phone.
So I haven't got anything like that. There's nothing baked into Rails. There's nothing free out there that I'm aware of, but there is, you aware of Jumpstart Pro by Chris Oliver? It's like a app kit for Rails, and Jumpstart Pro has an iOS and Android starting kit as well, which uses Turbo Native. So there's that. And in my book, I kind of teach you how to build a foundation as well. So there's nothing free that I'm aware of, but those are the two resources you can find if you're keen.
What is the picture with the licenses for those native libraries for Turbo Native? Are they open source licenses? Are they like GPL or whatever was popular? I mean, can I use it for free?
Yeah, it's MIT, open source MIT license. Everything that 37 Signals releases is MIT licensed.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask you about experience of hybrid comparing to React Native. Like 10 years ago, I developed a couple of applications in hybrid. The experience, as you told, it felt not super great. And then eventually, a couple of years ago, I moved to React Native. Which are the advantages that you think I would get if I move back to hybrid?
It's hard to say exactly, because I've spent a grand total of 30 minutes in my life looking at React Native and decided that this was hell and I didn't want anything to do with it. But the philosophy is quite different with React Native, because if I understand it correctly, it's like you write JavaScript code, but it renders everything as fully native. So it's just a very different kind of philosophy from Turbo Native and hybrid. It's like it's not really one or the other. It's more a use case thing, which one's right. I think the biggest advantage that you would have to drop React Native and go to like a hybrid approach is the same as for dropping like a fully native app and going to a hybrid approach. It just allows you to reuse views from your web app and saves effort that way, but it still gives you access to like the native code. And also I think because you're not trying to abstract away native stuff like React Native tries to do, the resources out there will be like when you try to ask for help from Stack Overflow or whatever, you'll find it a lot more useful because it'll give you Swift code you can just use. Otherwise, if you like, if you're using React Native and you try to do something natively and it gives you some Swift code, you're like, oh, but how do I do this in React Native? And because Swift and React Native, as far as I know, don't really play quite nicely with each other. So the way I see it with hybrid, you're just fighting the platform a little less. You're kind of augmenting the platform with this new technology rather than trying to abstract it away and fight with it.
Okay, that's the last question.
Maybe it's not a question, but like a follow-up on the React Native, because we've been successfully running a React Native app for 1 year, and we are basically amazed by this technology. And basically, the Swift code that you are mentioning is just a matter of adding an adapter. So it's like plug in, plug out. You can have iOS, Android developers doing the native stuff and basically using an adapter. The only thing why we don't go with like fully hybrid modes is that we prefer not to reuse code between the app, the web app, and the native apps. We want them to be different. Yeah, so.
Fair enough. If it works for you, then it works for you. Good. I have nothing against people using the tools they like if it accomplishes the job at hand. Just for me personally, React Native's not for me. But if it works for you, I'm not going to tell you you're doing it wrong. Because if it works, it works.
Okay, thank you very much.